Pollock diamond robbery. 2 of 2. With Bruce clear, the detectives were again without a suspect, and almost without a clue. Just here, however, Mr. Pinkerton recalled that on a trip to the West, some 3 years previous, to investigate the case of a man arrested at Reno, Nevada, on a charge of holding up a faro bank, and while stopping over in Salt Lake City, Utah, he had run across some sporting men in that city with whom he was well acquainted, and on his telling them where he was going and what his business was, one of them, whom Mr. Pinkerton had known for years, had said, "Why, the man at Reno is innocent. The men who committed that robbery are in this city. One of them is a smooth-faced boy, about 20 years of age, and the other is a heavy-set, dark-complexioned fellow, with a dark mustache. They are the intimate friends and companions of Jack Denton, the well-known gambler of Salt Lake, and only a short time ago, at Salt Lake, they entered a house one night, going in through a rear door, and compelled 2 ladies, who were just returned from a ball, to give up a large amount of diamonds. Though not interested in this particular robbery, Mr. Pinkerton had mentally jotted down the intimacy of Jack Denton with this class of people, and he recalled it now in connection with the fact that Jack Denton was one of the 2 gamblers to whom Pollock had exposed his diamonds at the pawnshop in Omaha. He at once decided to secure definite information in regard to the boy who had been with Denton at Salt Lake 3 years earlier. Proceeding immediately to Salt Lake City, and making cautious inquiries, he learned that the boy in question, since he first heard of him, had been arrested and convicted of robbery at Ogden, Utah, and sentenced to 1 year's term in the penitentiary. An investigation at the penitentiary disclosed that the young man had given the name of James Burke, had served out his sentence under that name, and had been released about 1 month previous to the Pollock robbery. Denton, in the meantime, had left Salt Lake and gone to Omaha, there to make his home. The boy Burke, argued the detective, had naturally followed his friend to that place. An accurate description of Burke was got from the records of the Utah Penitentiary, and some idea of him and his friends was derived from the officials of the prison. But where to find him in the whole Great West was a question. Inquiries at Salt Lake developed the further fact that Burke had had one intimate friend there, a man named Marshall P. Hooker. Hooker had now, however, left Salt Lake and removed to Denver. For a man of his class, Hooker was unusually talkative, and was known by crooks throughout the country as Windy Hooker. Plans were made for keeping a watch on him and on Jack Denton, in the hope, by shadowing the movements of these 2, of ultimately locating Burke. Through the free talk of Hooker, reported back to the detective, it was soon learned that Burke was known by the alias of Kid McCoy, and that he had recently been operating on the Pacific coast in holding up faro banks, and had also been concerned in 2 large robberies, one at Lincoln, Nebraska, and the other at Sacramento, California. His whereabouts at that time, however, were unknown. Much time had now elapsed since the robbery, and the sensation caused by it had died out. Jack Denton and his friends seldom spoke of it, and Hooker never spoke of it unless the subject was introduced to him. Both men were extremely shy of strangers, and it was almost impossible for a detective to draw them out, as anybody who introduced the subject of the robbery was at once looked upon with suspicion. For the purpose of creating further talk upon the subject, Mr. Pinkerton caused to be inserted in the Omaha papers an advertisement as follows. $500 will be paid for any information leading up to the identification of the party who robbed William G. Pollock on the Sioux City and Pacific train, November 4, 1892. William A. Pinkerton. Paxton House, Omaha, Nebraska. This at once attracted the attention of the local newspapermen, and when Mr. Pinkerton arrived in Omaha he was interviewed by all the papers in the city in regard to the robbery. Thus interest in the robbery was at once renewed. Denton and the other persons under suspicion commenced talking of the matter again, none more freely than Hooker. The latter was then in Denver. Mr. Pinkerton instructed Mr. James McParland, Denver superintendent of the Pinkerton Agency, to send for him, and say to him that he had understood that he Hooker could throw some light on the robbery, and that a large sum of money would be paid him for the information he gave. Mr. Pinkerton explained to Mr. McParland that Hooker would lie to him and endeavor to get the money by giving him false information, but to listen patiently to what he had to say and lead him on as far as possible without giving him any money. This done, Mr. Pinkerton further predicted that Hooker would go back to his cronies and boast of the way he was fooling Pinkerton and how much money he expected to get, and that eventually, through his boastings, he would prove the means of locating Burke, alias McCoy, and so, precisely, it fell out. Some of Hooker's companions were Pinkerton detectives, although Hooker did not know them as such, and they in time reported back that Burke was really the Pollock robber, that after committing the robbery he had gone back to Omaha, and from there had gone to Denver. From Denver he went to Salt Lake, and visited a prisoner in the Salt Lake Penitentiary with whom he was intimate, gave this prisoner some money, and went from Salt Lake west to the Pacific coast. Mr. Pinkerton next instructed that the record be examined for daring hold-ups that might have occurred in the country lately traversed by Burke. It was then found that a faro bank at Colorado City, a small place between Manitou Springs and Colorado Springs, had been entered late at night by a masked robber, who compelled the dealer and other persons to hold up their hands, took the money in the drawer, and escaped. That later on a similar robbery had been perpetrated at San Bernardino, California, that later still the pool rooms of James Malone, a noted gambler at Tacoma, Washington, had been treated in the same manner, and, finally, that a light or pane of glass in a jewelry store at Sacramento had been broken in and a tray of diamonds snatched from the window by a daring thief. And all of these deeds, Mr. Pinkerton learned ultimately through Hooker's talk, had been done by Burke. The watch on Denton at Omaha developed little, if anything, except that a close companionship existed between him and the Omaha pawnbroker. During the summer of 1893, learning that an intimate friend of Burke's, a burglar who had been in prison with him in the Utah Penitentiary, was confined in jail at Georgetown, Texas, Mr. Pinkerton decided to go and interview this man, and see if he could get any trace, through him, of the robber. In the meantime he instructed the detectives at Omaha and Denver to keep a particularly close watch on Jack Denton and Hooker. On Mr. Pinkerton's arrival at Austin, Texas, he found awaiting him dispatches from Superintendent McParland of the Denver agency, stating that through Hooker's talk they had learned that Kid McCoy, or Burke, had been arrested at Eagle, Colorado, with a kit of burglar tools in his possession, and was then in jail at Leadville, Colorado. Mr. Pinkerton at once telegraphed to have Conductor Ashmore and Mr. Shaw, the well digger, go to Leadville and see if they could identify the prisoner. Word was also sent to New York for Mr. Pollock to do the same. He also instructed Superintendent McParland at Denver to send his assistant, J.C. Fraser, to watch the case, so that if McCoy gave bail, or attempted to escape from the Leadville jail, they could be ready with a warrant for his arrest on account of the Pollock robbery. Having wired these instructions, Mr. Pinkerton proceeded on his journey to Georgetown, Texas, where he called on McCoy's former prison associate in the Utah Penitentiary, but was unable to get him to tell anything about McCoy, though he volunteered, if Mr. Pinkerton would furnish him a bond and get him out of his Texas scrape, to go to Omaha and compel the fence who had received the diamonds to turn back the property. But the rule of the Jewelers' Protective Union was to get the thief first and the property afterward, so no treaty was made with the Texas prisoner. Mr. Pinkerton now went to Kansas City, and found awaiting him there dispatches from Superintendent McParland of the Denver agency, stating that Conductor Ashmore and Messrs. Shaw and Pollock had positively identified the prisoner James Burke, alias Kid McCoy, as the man who assaulted Mr. Pollock and robbed him of his diamonds. Burke winced perceptibly when he saw Conductor Ashmore and Mr. Shaw, and went fairly wild when confronted by Mr. Pollock. Requisition papers were obtained from the governor of the state of Iowa on the governor of Colorado, and the Colorado offense being a minor one, Burke was turned over to Assistant Superintendent Fraser and another detective, to be taken to Logan, Harrison County, Iowa. Before leaving Leadville, Mr. Fraser was confidentially warned by the sheriff of the county that he could not be too careful of his prisoner, for that Burke, through a friend of the sheriff, had made a proposition to the latter to pay him $1,000 if he would secretly furnish him with a revolver when he left the jail, his design being, with this revolver, to either hold up or kill the two detectives who had him in custody and make his escape from the train. On trial at Logan, Iowa, the man was easily convicted, and was sentenced to imprisonment for a term of 17 years.